Hi, I am Anna or Riley, whichever you prefer. I use they it pronouns, and today I'm going to be talking about AroAce rep in TTRPGs and what it even means to be AroAce. Uh, but first, I want to talk really quickly about how LGBTQIA plus representation in TTRPGs has improved in years, which there's still a long way to go, but there has been a lot of improvements, especially with certain TTRPGs that are even centered around queerness and queer relationships, which is something to celebrate. But a lot of those things are focused on romantic relationships and the like, and there is nothing wrong with that. We love to see it, but there is a letter in the acronym, the A, that stands for asexual and aromantic, not ally, like some people have thought. And it's often forgotten. And that is what this talk is about today, because it would be great if there was more representation for these groups. First, before we talk about the representation, we need to know what are these terms, because I found that sometimes people don't actually know what it means to be asexual and or aromantic. So that's where we're going to start. What is asexuality? In order to understand this and what aromanticism is, you need to understand that there are different types of attraction. There is aesthetic, which means that you are attracted to the way someone looks. I think a lot of people have experienced this with, whether it's a fictional character or a real person. For me, a lot of times they're also fictional. There is platonic attraction, which means a more friendly attraction. Personally, I get what I call friend crushes, where I'm thinking like, this person is so cool. I really want to be their friend. I'm not romantically attracted to them, but I am just platonically attracted to them. And there is romantic attraction, which you usually see when someone is or ends up in a romantic relationship or has a romantic crush. And there is sexual attraction. And when it comes to the latter, people who are asexual experience little to no sexual attraction to anyone or most people. Asexuality is a spectrum, which includes something like demisexual, which is when you only really experience sexual attraction to someone after you've gotten really close to them. But it can also have something like ace flux, which means that your sexual attraction to people can fluctuate or how much sexual attraction you feel. And it's honestly a really broad spectrum and it's different for everyone. And what's also important about that spectrum is that asexual people can still choose to have sex. This is not something that a lot of people know. A lot of people assume that when you're asexual, you don't want to have sex. And there are a lot of people who don't. There are a lot of people who are sexual repulsed, even. But there are also people who still choose to have sex, whether it is because they just enjoy the feeling and they don't really care, they don't feel sexually attracted to the other person, or people who are demisexual who will have sex after they have gotten close to someone and feel sexually attracted to them, which does not make them any less demisexual or part of the asexual spectrum. And importantly, is that asexuality is not always in combination with aromanticism. And that is also something I will touch on later because that does often cause a very common misconception. Then, talking about aromanticism, similarly to asexuality, aromantic means that you experience little to no romantic attraction. And it is also a spectrum, which includes, once again, something like demi-romantic, where you have to be feeling really close to someone in order to even be able to develop romantic feelings for them. But also aeroflux, which similarly to aseflux means that the level of romantic attraction you feel can fluctuate. And there is things like how you feel romantic attraction, but the moment it's reciprocated, it fades, or the moment you're in a relationship with someone for longer, it fades. It's a whole spectrum, and it is just different for everyone. And people who are aromantic can still choose to be in a relationship. Often, when this happens, but not always, it is referred to as a queer platonic relationship or QPR for short. It is difficult to describe what the difference is between this and a romantic relationship when you're not a romantic. The bottom line of it is that a lot of aromantic people still like the idea of having a life partner and having that special someone. And sometimes they find them and they're not necessarily romantically attracted to them, but calling them a friend would be a disservice to what they feel for that person. And sometimes then the answer to that is a QPR. The partner in this case does not have to be aromantic. It is a mutual kind of decision where it's centered about around what do these two people or more people feel comfortable around. Like for example, it could be, we want to live together, but and I want to hold hands and cuddle, but I don't like kissing and I don't want anything, like I don't want to go on romantic dates, for example. Um, More about this later because this is also something that sometimes ends up becoming a problem actually when it comes to representation. And just as with asexuality, as I mentioned, being aromantic is not always a combination with asexuality. So now we know that what asexuality and aromanticism is, we introduce the term AroAce, which essentially means that you're both asexual and aromantic. And this doesn't have to be fully like asexual, fully aromantic. It can be anywhere on the spectrum. And within those within AroAce, these two identities might still coexist. For example, you can be demi-romantic, asexual, or aeroflux, aceflux. Literally any combination you can think of is part of AroAce, and very fun. It has its own flag, what I personally think is very pretty. Also, in the background of this slide, you can see the green flag, which is the aromantic one, and the purplish one is the asexual one, and then the very pretty one up front is the AroAce flag. So when you're AroAce or Arrow or Ace, but specifically AroAce, there are some common problems that people like me, for example, experience in daily life. And that is that often romantic relationships, for example, are seen as more valued than platonic ones. And I'm sure many people who are not AroAce have also experienced once before that maybe a friend of yours got in a relationship and then suddenly everything in that person's life revolved around a partner. I see our producer nodding. um, and that is something that is unfortunately true for many people, but it also is woven in the way that our society functions. It is, for example, at a family party, people asking you, "Have you found, are you dating anyone?" And the answer is no, and they see that as a bad thing. They'll say, "Your time will come, or you'll find the right person," assuming that that is what you want. You want to have a partner, you want to have a romantic relationship, and that without that, your life wouldn't be complete, or that just the friendships you have are not enough. They don't give the same satisfaction is the assumption. Similarly, sex is seen as a basic need that everyone has. It's often something people will say like, "Oh, it's just a natural thing that humans do and want and need." And like, well, that's not case for everyone. And while it is important to be sex positive, it can feel sometimes like you're not being seen or being excluded, or like there's something wrong with you for not wanting that. And those kind of sentiments, where relation or even where relationship without sex are seen as unhappy, or where you might be unhappy if you're not in a romantic relationships, that can be very frustrating over time if that is all you see, especially because romance is everywhere. And as much as I also enjoy a good romance story, it is annoying when you, for example, pick up a really cool seeming fantasy book after reading the blurb, and halfway through you realize that the blurb is not actually the plot, the romance in the book is the plot. Um, this happens with so many things, and that also can take a turn for the worse when people are not taking asexuality and aromanticism seriously, where they see it as, oh, you've not found the right person yet, or um, you're just kind of you're distant, or you're too picky, or something like that. Sometimes the comments get more harmful than that, unfortunately. And sometimes these issues I just mentioned continue at TTRPG tables. There are also issues with making assumptions about characters based on personality, which I will touch on later. In order to combat those issues at the tabletop tables at the tables, at the TTRPG tables, um, we need to first address also what representation should be like and what it is currently like, because representation matters. I think that is something that we've come to realize. Most people has come to realize. And what's important about AroAce rep, for example, is that it is visible because sometimes it's implied. You'll see characters in media, not just in TTRPG scenes, but just in media as a whole, where it's sort of hinted at that this person doesn't want to date anyone, doesn't want to have sex, but it's never really made canon, or it's never really mentioned that this person is AroAce. And that is a shame because it's always nice to, I mean, as nice as it is to make headcanons about a character, having it confirmed that this character is like you is definitely important. Sometimes representation is there, but it's flawed. For example, you often see with AroAce, or mostly with asexuality, that a character is labeled as asexual, but they also don't want any relationships, or they're just not interested in anyone, and that is a problem because asexuality is often linked to aromanticism, and that makes the representation that the makers of this tried to do, flawed, and that is also a shame. Sometimes representation is limited. For example, a character will be just like fully arrow ace, but there's no other combinations. I have rarely seen, for example, someone who is alloromantic, meaning they are not aromantic, and asexual. Or the other way around, where someone is asexual but like a raging flirt, for example. And while having any kind of representation, any arrow ace, good arrow ace representation is good, it would also be nice to see the full spectrum represented because that is what our human world is like. And sometimes the representation is good, but it still misses the point. And that is the main issue there, is what I mentioned with the QPR, where people sometimes, whether it is writers or whether it is an APs or any kind of media, will put arrow ace characters in QPRs to mimic a romantic relationship, but without the logic behind it. It is kind of like, oh, this character is really close to this other character, but they are ace, so they can't really be dating, but we kind of want them to, so we'll put them in a QPR, which is not how it works, and it misses the point of what it means to be arrow ace completely. And that is something that I would really like to see less of. I've talked about what asexuality is. I've talked about what aromanticism is. I've talked about some issues and why representation matters. But what I'm going to talk about now is, I think, what most people find the most interesting, or at least people who want to be writing or playing these characters in any kind of TTRPG setting or anything really. And that is just, how do you do that? Especially if you're not AroAce yourself and you want to try and explore this identity, or if you are a writer and you want to write like AroAce NPCs or characters or any kind of storyline relating to that, what do you do? I'm going to tell you. um, First of all, what you shouldn't do is, I think, what you shouldn't do with most things, and that is fall into stereotype. Most commonly, what I see regarding RA stereotypes is something like nerds and innocent characters. If you write a nerd, they are inherently almost not non-sexual, and then are labeled as asexual, which are two different things. um but also innocent characters, let's say, like the really like shy character, or like the ray of sunshine, who apparently doesn't know what sex is, or has no wants or needs in that department, just because of the personality. Also, very commonly, autistic characters are linked to being arrow A's, which, as an arrow A's autistic, I guess I would fall in that stereotype. But I also know that there are many autistic people out there, probably a majority, who are not arrow A's. And the problem here is that it conflates personality with sexual and romantic orientation, which does not make any sense. So if you are to play or write, like, let's say, like a nerdy character, and you make them arrow ace, ask yourself, why did you pick that? Why did you? I will also touch on that later with the do's. You should not treat being AroAce as a monolith, it's actually really important to examine the character's preferences. When you make this character, when you write this character, think to yourself, yeah, sure, they're asexual, but to what degree? Are they just not interested in sex at all? Are they demisexual? Are they maybe aslux? Are they asexual, but they do still enjoy sex? Are they sex repulsed? Or when they're aromantic, ask yourself, are they fully aromantic? They not experience any romantic feelings? Are they experiencing romantic feelings, but to a very limited degree or in special circumstances? Do they need to be very close to someone first in order to experience this? And if they don't experience it, do they still want a life partner, or are they perfectly happy on their own with a bunch of friends and other kinds of love around them? That is really important to examine before you label a character as arrow ace, because it's such a wide range that it's good also for when you play, especially a character like this, to know how your character responds to certain situations, especially if they are romantic and asexual. If someone flirts with them, and or if someone wants to take something further, how do they respond? That is handy to have explored beforehand. And then obviously the other don't I already hinted at is don't put arrow ace characters in QPRs to replace the romantic relationship. Do ask yourself, why am I doing this? Is this something that my character would want? Is my character interested in having a life partner like this? And is the character that my character would be in a QPR with someone they could see themselves with long term? Or am I doing this because I think my character and the other character are cute together and my character is RA, so they can't be in a romantic relationship, so I'm just putting them in a QPR to mimic the feeling of, which is never a good reason to put a character in a QPR. Definitely something to explore. Then what you should do is, as I also said, ask yourself why you chose this orientation. And I'm not saying that there needs to be a reason for a character to be ace or a character to be any identity, but you need to make sure that you're not going for a stereotype. So if you're, like I said, making a nerdy character and you're making them ace, do check with yourself, am I making them arrow ace because I can't see this dirty character be sexual in any kind of way? Or is it an identity that I genuinely think fits this character that I'm imagining? It is important to question yourself if you're not arrow ace all the way in this creating process for your choices. Then also, I think should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. When you do write or play an Arrow Ace character, when you're not Arrow Ace or either of those, take time to read up on Arrow and Ace experiences across the spectrum. This means following creators or looking things up on YouTube or reading articles that share the experience of aromantic and asexual and aroace people. And as a bonus, I would recommend reading up on something called relationship anarchy. I'm not saying to read into it or that you have to read into it deeply or that you have to agree with it. But I think personally, relationship anarchy really questions the way that we view any kind of relationships and how we put them in a hierarchy and what they mean to us. And I think that is something when you are writing or playing an arrow ace character really important to look into, because one of the main things that especially aromantic but also asexual people run into is the issue with hierarchy in certain kind of relationships. And understanding that view is, I think, a very core part, especially for being aromantic but also for being asexual. And a little shout out to the AP Deck of Many Aces, which is a TTRPG actual play where, and I could be saying this wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. Every player on there is asexual and or aromantic, as are the characters. And I think that's really cool. And lastly, on the do list is break stereotypes. Make an arrow ace bard. Make a very charismatic arrow. Make a hopeless romantic asexual person. Just think of any stereotype when it comes to anything sexual or romantic and just smash it. I personally love when people break stereotypes. I will say the AroAce Bart, shout out to my friend Mike who did that. And I honestly love it. I love something like that. Definitely explore what you can do with those stereotypes and then how you can just smash them to pieces. Right. I am nearing the end of this talk, but I wanted to leave on a fun note. And I wanted to first say that everyone loves a good love story, including me. But when I say this sentence, everyone loves a good love story, I do want to ask, and I'm making an assumption here, but I'm willing to bet I'm right. Why did your mind immediately go to a romantic one when you hear the word love story? Because I think one of the core things of many TTRPGs is a found family, which everyone, well, most people love a found family. And in a found family, well, there can be romantic relationships at the core as a group, as a whole. It is typically about platonic love. It is about strong bonds. It's about a group of randos being thrown together in a chaotic situation, usually, or any kind of situation, and then learning to love and appreciate each other, even if there is bickering, but that's also part of a family. And I think that that kind of found family is also a love story, and love can exist in many different forms. And I'm going to mention some of those because I think there are many fun relationship dynamics that I would love to see more of TTRPGs. If you are planning on playing an AroAce character, or are just, even if you're not doing that, but you're interested in playing just a dynamic that revolves around love, but not romantic love, I have a list of suggestions. And I have played many of these, and I can say that they are really fun. First of all, probably one of my favorites is siblings, especially if they're complex. Give all like the sibling drama, put it in there, and let them work through their issues, and let them put them in the heat of battle, and have them put their differences aside to try and help each other. Because I think anyone who has siblings will understand that sibling relationships in general are complicated. You would probably, if you have a good bond with your siblings, take a bullet for them, but you would not let them have your last cookie. That's kind of the relationship that you have with your siblings, and they are really fun to play and explore. Um, Another fun one is what I call a dedicated protector. And here you can think of, for example, a royal who has a personal bodyguard, or anyone who is dedicated to protecting the other person. And I love it personally when at some point it no longer is duty for them, but they genuinely care deeply about this person. And especially if the care is then also returned with a sense of worry. Think the protector has just done their job and shielded their ward from danger, and the ward looks at this wounded person and is like, oh, you're wounded, and tries to take care of them, and without there being anything romantic, just that kind of like, I understand that you're here to protect me, but also you should look after yourself. And the other person being like, my life doesn't matter as much as yours. The whole like dynamic, there are so many things you can do there where you can explore that relationship, that does not have to be romantic. And in a similar vein, mentor and teacher is really lovely because it explores a form of love through knowledge. It is a mentor being like, I love this person enough to teach them everything I know. I might not be here anymore one day, but I will always be with you through the things that I have taught you. And I hope that you one day also find someone you love enough to teach these things to. And I think that is also a beautiful dynamic that does not have to be romantic. And I think it's better if it's not romantic. Um, Another fun one is that I dubbed the emotional center and the closed book. The emotional center is someone who feels things very deeply, who in a group is the one that will always check in with people and that will put the needs of the others above their own. And the closed book is the person who you'd have an easier time pulling their teeth than pulling any kind of personal information out of them. And I think this dynamic is really lovely because often what you can do with this is that the closed book learns to open up a little bit to the emotional center, and the emotional center learns that they can put themselves first sometimes instead of putting others above their own needs. And this dynamic, while I will admit, is fun when it's romantic, it's also really fun when it's not. And it's definitely, especially long term, can be really rewarding when you start comparing how characters started and how they ended. Because usually, if done well, what you see is that they start becoming more similar. And that is definitely a very special dynamic. Um, a fun one is the colleague duo. I think of any kind of like detective series or um think of medical dramas, anything where there is a kind of like sometimes also buddy comedy going on. It could be people who have just been doing this job for far too long and are tired, and that's, their whole shtick. It could be people who are both new on the job and both figuring it out. It could be someone who is new and someone who's been around longer. But colleague duos lend themselves for a lot of fun, a lot of bickering usually, but also a lot of love because I think colleagues are not people you choose. They're just there that there's people that you happen to work with, but sometimes you find a colleague that you really get along with and they might become friends, or even if they're not friends, it still can be someone you care for, and that is also a very interesting story to explore. I'm nearly at the end of this. I promise there's only two more, as you can see on the screen. Childhood friends is a very fun one, especially just like siblings, if they have ongoing drama. I know that there are a lot of people who like to have the childhood friends to lovers trope, but obviously we're not talking about romantic love today. We are talking about anything but sexual love. Childhood friends is very interesting, especially if they've known each other since they were very young, because similarly to siblings, this person has been in their life almost forever. And if there then is any point at which there was drama going on, this can be super petty. I have once played a childhood friends duo where the drama was because they both liked different bands and the bands became rivals. It can be very silly, but it is also very fun because it gives space for exploring why did we become friends, what drove us apart, and how can we mend this. And sometimes those characters need to be put in a difficult situations to realize that the drama they've got going on probably is very petty. And if it's not petty, it can be something more serious. Let's say friend A had a crush on someone and friend B knew that but went to date that person instead, behind their back. It can be very juicy sometimes. But I think there's something so special about having a friend that you've known since you were little. That is a very fun dynamic to explore with someone, or to write about, and to see what this kind of relationship can overcome if people are just being mature about it, or maybe not. Maybe sometimes these stories don't end well, but just the love still persists. Sometimes people become enemies, but they just care enough about each other to, in the heat of the moment, still spare them or to save their life, maybe. Lastly, there is also one of my favorites, what I call the bickering jokesters. Here are the people who you could not get them to admit that they care for each other, but if someone else bullies that person, you will get stabbed probably. They're usually like the really tired, like old like veterans in their job or whatever, or just the people who through fate keep being put together even though they really don't want to, and eventually they learn to appreciate each other's company. They will say that they wouldn't care if the other person dropped dead, but if that person is bleeding out, they will give them their own blood if they can, kind of situation. And that is also something that isn't romantic. It is just two people who love each other, even if they will not admit it. You will have to have a really hard time trying to get them to admit it, but they do love each other, and you can see it in everything they do. And I think that at the end of all of this is the most important thing, that love, as you look at this list, can exist in so many different forms. and it can be expressed in so many different ways, whether it is by passing on knowledge, whether it is by putting this other person's needs above yourself, whether it is about being comedy relief to them in a moment of hardship, or just sitting in silence and sharing food. Love is not inherently romantic, and that is at or sexual in that matter, and that is at the core of all of this. And that is why having AroAce characters, I think, makes a game sometimes also more special, because it really forces you to look at what it means to love someone when it is not tied to romantic love. And that is where I will conclude my talk. And I thank everyone for listening, and everyone at Euphoria for having me. You can find me anywhere at Peculiar Planets and pretty much every social media. I also write tabletop stuff, I write comics, I do sensitivity reading. All of that you can find on my website, peculiarplanets.com. And yeah, that is it. I also do, if anyone after this has questions, I do sensitivity reading and consulting for AroAce stuff. So do hit me up if you have more questions.